Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. So those of you, if you could find seats, there's still plenty in the front. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Elizabeth Brown. I'm a Columbus City Council member, and I chair the Economic Development Committee. When I first came into office over a year and a half ago, Mayor Ginther's term was first starting. Director Shoney came to me and said they were interested in doing this incentive study to review the current incentive and abatement policies that we have as a city. I was very excited to hear that because we have some great tools in the city of Columbus, but they haven't been updated for a while, and we also don't have an update schedule. We don't have any kind of commitment to every blank years revisit this and look at these numbers. So I was really glad to hear that the director was moving in that direction. One thing that I asked the department to commit to at that time was doing a series of open meetings before we had legislation or policies written down, because it is so important to get input from residents during that actual policy formation phase. So this is the fourth of 4 meetings. All of the meetings have had the same content on the slideshow. Each of them have had very different questions, and plenty of different discussion following that, because that's led by all of you. But you are getting the same information here and in your packet as the 3 other meetings. After this meeting, the city is going to take into account, the department will take into account the input they've received before they have a proposal to council to consider. And we will do another public hearing at that time, but more traditionally kind of in council chambers to consider legislation. So I just want to thank you all for being here today and being a part of that process to engage in public feedback before the policy proposals have been put forward. You'll see in the slideshow that there are recommendations that the consultant, the data they put together sort of indicates, but there's a lot of formation and policy work to happen within those recommendations. So your feedback is critical. I want to thank the Department of Development for all of their hard work in putting together all of these meetings. And I just want to point out that CTV is here tonight, and so we do have to use the microphone so that they can pick up the sound. And you all, when you ask questions, will also have to use the microphone. All right, with that, thank you, Director Shoney.
Thank you, Councilmember Brown. I normally hate using microphones, and when Liz says that we have to use them, it actually really is painful for me. So I will do my best not to try and speak too loud. We started this process, I thought I was the only person who got excited when talking about incentives, but I found out that's not the case. But I will try and keep my excitement to a minimum so I don't kind of blow you out with the volume. Thanks everybody for coming out. I do want to make a point of thanking the staff. This is the 4th of 4 that we've done, and it has been a lot of work on the part of our team, and I do want to thank all of them for putting this all together and working through this. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through a little bit of an education process in terms of what our incentives are, what our objectives are, talk to you about the analysis that was done, and at a couple points I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for questions. And just as importantly as asking for questions, I want to know what your priorities are. Anytime you policy change or a decision on policy, and we'll walk through what some of the numbers are, you can get a lot of things done, but you can't get everything done. Life's about making choices. And you can't make choices until you understand what your priorities are. So when we get to a couple points in the analysis, I really want to hear from you what your priorities are in terms of what we do next. The other thing I want to say is if you came tonight to tell us that we need to change our abatement policies, I have good news for you. We agree. The question for us is how. And just as important as how, what I said earlier, to what purpose is our objective? What do you want us to be looking to accomplish with these tools? So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through a little bit about how the city's changing. I'm actually going to start at the end. I'm going to start with, first I'm going to start with what are our abatements, what's the subject matter that we're talking about. Then I'm going to go straight into what our conclusions are, and then I'm going to back it up and talk about how we got there. Because I don't think it's really hard to comprehend the analysis the first time you go through it unless you understand where we're going. So I'm going to do it a little bit backwards. We're going to first cover the business incentive side of the study, and then we're going to go back and cover the housing side of the study. So what we did is we contracted with HR&A Associates out of New York City. They're planning and analysis. We real estate data analytics firm, VSI, to do an independent analysis for us to look at what is the data. We found a lot of interesting stuff. But first, I need to talk about when we say incentives and abatements. I promise I'm not going to read a lot of stuff in this presentation. I apologize for the size. I promise I won't read everything, but this is something I'm going to read. What is an incentive? An incentive is a program that provides a benefit in order to motivate a business or an individual to do or accelerate something that the city wants. Tax abatements encourage development by bringing down the cost, making development more likely. Job tax credits make job creation more likely by providing funding back to a company if it creates jobs within the city. We're all familiar with incentives on a daily basis. I think probably a lot of you guys carry one of these around on your keychain, right? This is how Giant Eagle incentivizes me. They want to collect a ton of data on how I shop. And in order to do that, they give me a discount on my gas. That is a form of incentive. It is providing a financial benefit in order to get something that you want. In this case, we're doing the same thing with real estate. We've defined what we want, and we're using a financial incentive to get it. So what is a property tax abatement? A property tax abatement is a type of incentive that reduces or eliminates the property tax on the increased value created by an investment for a defined period of time. When you define things, it's also helpful to define what they're not. Here's what here's what abatements do not do. Abatements do not reduce the taxes currently being paid on a piece of property. They only reduce the amount of taxes being paid on the growth because of an investment. They don't last forever. You'll hear property tax incentives talked about in terms of two things. One is a percentage. So what is the percentage of the growth in the property tax that is abated, and then a period of years. So we'll talk about 75% for 10 years. So 75% of the incremental tax is abated for a period of 10 years. They don't require the city, the county, the state, the schools, the libraries, anybody to pay money to a developer or a property owner. As I said earlier, they are a reduction in the growth of the property tax. And they don't have any value at all unless a developer or property owner invests money to build something new or refurbish an existing building. So that's what they are. The key thing, one of the key things that is important to understand is how, to this point, we have used them and to what purpose we have used them. And to this point, there have really been three objectives that we have tried to accomplish by using abatements and tax incentives. One is financial. We try to use abatements only in cases where we think it's a good long-term financial investment for the city. So that after the term of the abatement expires over a long period, because we have a long time horizon, the city is better off financially. It's number one. Number two, in order to spur job growth through either direct job creation or investment, property tax, or property investment in communities. And 3, improvement of communities through new physical asset investment, building of buildings, rehabbing of buildings. Really, those are the 3 objectives that the 3 objectives, goals, whichever one. I get my strategic planning nomenclature wrong all the time. Those are the 3 things we're trying to accomplish with incentives. One of the questions that when I talked earlier about priorities, one of the key questions for us now is those 3 are great, but should there be more? And what else should those things be? And what are our priorities among those other potential possibilities of objectives? So in conclusion, you can just, if you got other things to do now, you can listen to this slide and go home. It's not really what I want, but you're welcome to. This is what we are drawing from the consultant's recommendations and our own look at it. Basically, on the business incentive side, Columbus is competing nationally and internationally for jobs and workers. Part of our strategy has to be keeping costs down. Abatements and incentives are key to that. They will continue to be. It is a competitive market. They will continue to be necessary. The city is competitive for business internationally. Not only are we competing, but we are competitive, right? We are cost competitive. We can compete. We're competing and we can compete nationally. So we'll see some analysis later that shows from a cost basis, when we're competing against our peer cities, we do pretty well. The challenge really is when you look at how we compare on an incentives basis with our suburban neighbors. Our suburban neighbors are more aggressive in using their property tax abatements in particular and their job creation abatements than we are. And we've got some data that'll show that. So that means we need to look at what we're doing and decide if we're going to do more. We are very transparent at the end of the day in terms of saying what the deal was that we struck. We are not very transparent in saying how we're going to get there in how we do deals or how we got there. So there are 2 ways to look at any negotiation. One is to say I'm going to keep all my cards close to my vest. I'm going to control all the information and try and get the best deal I can by knowing what I know and keeping the other side in the dark, right? The other side is to go in and say, guys, this is where I am. This is where I'm going to be. Make your decision. We will be somewhere on that continuum. Basically, we can do a better job of being more transparent up front, saying to that business that's coming in, here's how we're going to make our decisions. Here's the criteria we're going to use. So you feel like you're getting a fair deal, and then you as residents know how we're making those decisions so that you feel like your tax dollars are being well managed. So those are the big conclusions on the business incentive side. Number of conclusions on the housing side. In our most challenged neighborhoods like Linden, so let me back up. We had the consultant look at 4 neighborhoods as examples of types of neighborhoods in our city. We had them look at Linden, the Hilltop, Short North, and the Near East Side. And we'll get into how we define those and all that stuff later. But when you look at Linden and the Hilltop, the conclusion was, and in each of those neighborhoods, we had them look at how much it would cost to build a type of housing that would potentially be built by the private sector in each of those neighborhoods. We'll get into this later. What they found when they went through that analysis was that in Linden and the Hilltop, even with a 15% or 100% 15-year property tax abatement, we are nowhere near having rents in those neighborhoods that support private investors building new housing stock in those neighborhoods. So what that means is that we not only need to do abatement, we need to do more. Because the other alternative in order to get new investment in those areas is have rents rise. And that's not our objective either. So we'll get to it. You'll see the analysis. I see the confused look. We'll get there, Tammy, I promise. The lesson of the last 7 years in the Short North. is that when you have neighborhoods that incentives combined with an accessible location, a strong sense of community, and an interesting housing stock, you can spur private investment, or private development, and generate rent and sale prices that make new construction feasible. We've seen that. The surprising lesson for me, and we'll get into this later, is the speed with which it happened. This is the conclusion that has generated the most interest and has been most widely reported on, but I don't think it's been fully accurately reported on, not because anybody's trying to do a bad job, it's just really complex. Low-rise construction in the short north probably does not need property tax abatement. What do I mean by this? Is think of your off-high street, your typical off-high street development. Less than 6 stories, stick construction, doesn't need structured parking, right? Basic, relatively cheap to construct. You don't need any subsidy for that. Mid-rise construction, dense construction where you go above 6 stories, you have to get into concrete and steel construction, and you need structured parking. Those projects do not make financial sense for the private sector without abatement. It doesn't have to be 100% 15-year abatement, but you do need some additional subsidy to achieve that density. Let me say one other thing from the outset. I am a supporter of density along our commercial corridors. I'm going to talk in a minute about the demographic changes we're going to see in our city. I do not believe that sprawl is a good solution for our city. And the only way to fight sprawl is to see additional density. So know that's my analysis and my bias going in. We can have long discussions around density. I'm going to talk about the trends we're seeing and why I think density is important, but know that is the assumption that the bias that I'm coming at this with. And again, the key policy question, do we reduce abatement rates or do we require more from developers and property owners in order to obtain abatement? Do we require them to do more workforce housing? Do we require them to do green building standards? Do we require cleanup of brownfields? Do we require building of more office space? Those are the kinds of things, that's the key policy question for us. You can either reduce the abatement or you can try and get more out of it. Both of which are very valid options. All right, where are we going as a city? The Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, MORPC, did a study year and a half ago called Insight 2050. The analysis basically showed, predicted that over the next 20 to 30 years, we could see an additional 1 million people come to the metropolitan area. That's 50% growth in the metropolitan area over the next 30 years. We could see more growth over the next 30 years than we have over the last 75. That is a trend that we see happening today. We see a continuation of that trend. We believe that there are things that we can do to direct that and focus that, but I don't think there's things we can do to stop that, and let me explain to you why. When you look at how our country is changing overall, those of you that are in the baby boom generation don't like to admit you're getting old, but you do like to admit that you're retiring. That has those in the business community completely freaked out about where they find talent. And so businesses are going to cities like Columbus, like Austin, like Boston, like New York, like San Francisco, like Seattle, that have the ability to generate large amounts of talent in the next generation of workforce. So we will see growth on the population side, and that creates a whole host of pressures for us. And it creates challenges in terms of us keeping costs down. We want to remain a high value. We don't want to be a cheap market. We want to be a high value market. So the analysis that we had done, we asked the consultants to look at 6 competitors, 3 local, 3 national. The national competitors were Charlotte, Dallas, and Indianapolis. The local competitors were Dublin, Groveport, and New Albany. And these are locations that we see across a wide spectrum of different types of business attraction projects that we are competing with on very regular basis. There's a lot of words here, but the basic analysis, as I said earlier, is that when you look at our national competitors on a cost basis, we can be very competitive with the kinds of abatements we've been offering. Traditionally, outside of downtown, we are offering 10-year 75% property tax abatement for warehouse, distribution, and office projects. That's been our traditional level. What they found, though, and the map is more telling, is that when you look at our regional competitors, if we're at 10-year 75% abatement, and they're at 100% 15-year abatement, and the location does not have something specific that makes being in the city better than being in Groveport or New Albany, you make the decision if you're a business, right? If I'm building a warehouse and my margins are pennies on the square foot, and I can be in Obetz or Groveport and get 100% 15-year abatement, and all the city of Columbus is offering is 10 years at 75%, those jobs are going to those locations. If I'm considering a location in up at Polaris, which is in the city of Columbus, out at Hamilton Road and 161, which is in the city of Columbus, or a location in Westerville or New Albany for an office, you tell me which decision you're going to make. That's the competitive environment that we're in. The other thing everybody always asks about downtown, in downtown it's about the cost of parking. Currently, the garage across the street from my office is getting, I'm looking in the back of the room in case somebody corrects me on this, I think they're getting $150 a month for a space. It costs $20,000 to $30,000 a space to build structured parking. You compare that to people go to the suburbs and they can build all the flat surface parking they want and offer it for free. We have to be more competitive in downtown. So a little bit more detail on the conclusions that were drawn. These are the consultants' conclusions. The earlier slide that I showed were kind of my and my team's highlights of these. A couple of these we covered. You know, we need to reevaluate basically where we are competitively based on that last map. The other thing that we need to do is we need to look and think creatively about how we handle incentives for existing buildings and incentives particularly for existing office buildings. Dublin does, I had on the map that Dublin offers the 15-year 100% abatement. They only do that in a couple small locations. Really where Dublin focuses is on providing upfront cash incentives to building owners to upgrade old buildings. You can do that when you have the kind of financial resources that Dublin has, and they're generating enough money that they can pay that up front versus having an incentive that pays out over time. But that's something they said we need to look at. Consider implementing tiered levels of incentives to prioritize job centers. This is one of their recommendations. I don't know that I necessarily agree with this. To me, I'll take 25, 50 jobs, good jobs, anywhere in this city, anywhere I can get them. And I'm going to compete for those jobs all day long, wherever they are. I'll compete harder if they're in a distressed neighborhood, but I'm going to compete for every job everywhere. So I don't want to limit myself on my ability to compete. And then continuing downtown, continue our incentives downtown because of what I talked about earlier in terms of the cost structure. In terms of job, that's kind of the real estate side. We did ask them some questions about job quality and access to opportunity. This is where they recommended that we do a better job of creating a scorecard to explain how we're making our decisions and how we get to what projects we offer incentives on and what we don't and what rates and terms we offer on incentives. Like I said earlier, I think that's one of those ones where I read it and I'm like, yeah, we need to do better at that. So we're going to work on doing that. Consider implementing tiered levels of incentives to prioritize job quality. Do we offer more for jobs that offer certain career pathways that pay more? Are there things that we can do to prioritize jobs? We asked them to take a very specific look at the issue of wage rates and what level of job, what wages should be the minimum that we offer incentives for. And what they found was there's not nobody's figured this out nationally. There are a couple of ways that people do it. One is to look at what are their entry level, what are their kind of entry industries. In Columbus, that would be call centers and distribution centers. And what's a good starting wage within that industry? And you set your floor there. Others have just simply said, we're going to set it at $15 an hour, we're going to set it at $12 an hour, we're going to set it at $10 an hour. And they've just set a rate. We've got more analysis ourselves to do on that piece. And we've got more discussion with our members of council and the administration. I have my opinion. I think some members of council have different opinions on that, so I'll not share what my opinion is at this point. And I should also recognize Councilmember Stinziano came in while I was talking. And then finally, continue looking for ways to support more economic inclusion. So how do we make sure that we're doing things that have people who've been disconnected from job centers, connecting them to job centers? Are there things we can do on the transportation side? Are there things we can do to support folks who are coming out of the criminal justice system and allowing them to get jobs? Are there other things that we can be doing? We're always looking for those things. This is a great call to action for us. All right, that was just my conclusions. I've talked about them, I think, 5 times already, so I'm not going to do it again. This is a spot where I stop, take a breath, take a drink, and see if you guys have any questions, comments. You want to share anything that struck you about this point in the presentation, and I'm going to move on to housing in a minute. And you've got to go to James for the microphone. Here, use this one.
Looks like they're built up and running out of land.
Mm-hmm.
So as part of the study, that and the reason that they got to offer incentives for rebuild is because they don't have any more land to build on. And did they include that in our study done of what our existing job building inventory warehouse stock is? Just curious.
We didn't have them look at land use, we didn't have them do a land use analysis. I can tell you, just from our own experience, you can finding land in the suburbs that is developable, while it's getting more expensive, it's still fairly doable. Particularly along the northern tier is still strong for office. The warehouse and distribution and manufacturing down in the Rickenbacker corridor, Canal, Groveport, Grove City, Obetz. There's still a fair amount of land down there. Actually, in those areas, particularly around Rickenbacker, we tend to have more land, in part because we haven't been offering the incentives. But we didn't have them do that analysis. Who else has a question? I'll come over here, and then I'll come over to you. Is that working now, James?
It's just more an inquiry. On the suburban business incentives, those were all regulated by state laws, or?
So the state sets a limit. What I showed, the 15 years, 100% is the state maximum. So that is the limit that the state sets, but there's some guidelines, but I wouldn't call it it's not heavily regulated by the state, but they do set limits on how far we can go.
So what you're saying is that in our experience, they have chosen to not go to the limits.
So to this point, Columbus has chosen not to go to the maximum, except in downtown. That's the one place we've gone to the maximum, and a couple other places here and there. You had a question, I think. I thought I saw a hand down. Oh, over here.
Hello?
Yeah.
So my big concern with the way that the just general reasoning for this is being done, and I think this is the case when a city pretty much ever does anything like this, is the reasoning is from the basis of the city as a unit and in terms of geography. So you're considering the impact on areas and neighborhoods, but you're not actually considering the impact on the people that currently live in those areas. So oftentimes when you see changes in neighborhoods, it's not changes for the people in that neighborhood, it's change because you've displaced the people that live there. So that is a whole issue, but so you're talking about the city of Columbus needs to do whatever it can, sacrifice potential tax revenue and so forth to encourage job creation within the city of Columbus proper. But for the average person that lives in Columbus that has to drive to work, because in my opinion our public transportation is still not all that great, what's the difference between having to try to drive to Short North and find parking there versus just driving to Dublin? Like, as a citizen, why do I care if the job is in Columbus or if it's in Dublin?
So, as a resident of the city of Columbus, you care because what's the percentage of the city budget that's funded, not that this is a quiz for my council member, that's funded by, I think it's...
By taxes on businesses?
It's 70%, I think, of the city budget is funded by income tax. Not property tax, income tax. So that's why you care. And if that job goes to Dublin, that revenue doesn't come to the city of Columbus as a resident of the city. If you're a resident of the region, you don't care. If you're a resident of Dublin, you want it to come to Dublin, right? If you're a resident of what, it's basic budgeting. No, you pay income tax based on where you work. So that's one of the, actually, I'm glad you said that. It's, and you know, this is one of those things where you live in this world and you forget that not everybody, so in the state of Ohio, you don't pay income tax where you live, you pay income tax where you work. So, look, there's a reason why Dublin, from a financial standpoint, and this is great for Dublin. They have a relatively low number of residents to the number of office workers that they have, and those office workers tend to be fairly highly compensated, which leads to great amount of revenue for Dublin. That's the way the system works. It's not perfect, but you ask why we do that, that's why. Yes, sir. Here, I'm closer, you can use this one.
Could you explain about, okay, income taxes go to the city where you work.
Yeah.
Well, property taxes are collected by the county, is that correct? And how does that fit in with, you work over the City Department of Development?
So property taxes go, we do get some revenue from property taxes. I think 6.8% of the city budget comes from property taxes. But the bulk of property taxes go to the schools and the county. I think 60-some-odd% of property taxes go to the schools. And then the balance goes to the county. Not much of it goes to the county general revenue fund, but most of it goes to county levy agencies. Here.
Yes, back in March of this year, Governing Magazine had a story about transparency nationally around the country. And Columbus was ranked very low in transparency on tax incentives, that there was no information available online. Can you talk a little bit about transparency on this kind of thing and how the city is going to do better and not come up in those low rankings next year?
Obviously, we disagree with the ranking, first of all. We were one of, the question was, Governing Magazine did a ranking back in March that ranked the city of Columbus relatively low as it relates to transparency in terms of our incentives. I honestly can't figure it out. We were one of the first 3 cities to follow the new Government Accounting Standards Board rules on disclosure for GASB. All of our information on our tax incentives is available publicly. We try and put it online. We have our Tax Incentive Review Council meetings that happen every August. And, but as I said earlier, we fully recognize there are some areas where we can do better. One of their recommendations is we can do better on transparency even before we cut the deal and be more transparent in terms of how we do it. You know, rankings are rankings and they have their own criteria, and some make sense, some don't. Yeah.
So kind of going back to the question of people being displaced from neighborhoods, I know some cities will, in exchange for abatements, will require something like a certain percentage of the housing created be for low-income or middle-income residents. Has Columbus considered doing that?
That is a great transition to the housing section, which is, and I'll get to that, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that in a little bit. Did you have a question?
Actually, I was going to bring up the same thing because
Okay.
it does seem that patterns of development over the past 20 years have not equitably benefited low-income people. And I know that there are, Mark Conti brought it up on Monday morning, in inclusive zoning requirements that require builders to put aside a certain amount of density for low-income properties. And I also wanted to bring up, probably also having to do with the residential part, community benefit agreements in which developers are contractually obligated through a process of negotiation to provide, for example, in Cleveland, there's like more than $1 billion of things going on right now, and one of the common elements of those agreements is that they have to hire a certain number of low-income area workers, and it's a way to, you know, more equitably generate benefit. And I was going to ask the same question. Are we thinking of either of those things?
And as I said, we'll talk about all that. A couple comments before I get into this section. We do still have affordable housing in this city. It doesn't feel like it, and in some neighborhoods, it really doesn't feel like it, but it still exists. But we're at a point where we do need to start thinking about the future. And what we've done in the past, I don't think will continue to work. The other thing I'll say about affordable housing, and this goes to my earlier comment about density. I was an economics major in college. And I don't remember much from college. I went to OU. And thank you for those of you who laughed. Damn, I forgot I'm on tape. Can you guys edit that? Okay, thank you. The microphone is actually in my hand, and I still said that. I was an economics major, and what happens when you have increased demand and you have no increase in supply? Prices go up. So we can regulate and we can incentivize all we want, but you will not be successful at controlling prices when you have increasing demand unless you control supply, or unless you increase supply. So we're going to get into a lot of stuff, and I just want to kind of put that in your head as we're going through all this and we're thinking about what are our policy choices. Know that when we talk about these different levers that we have to pull, we need more, right? I mean, if what I talked about at the outset in terms of us being an attractive place for people to come and businesses to come, we're going to see increased demand, so that means we need more supply. All right, so as I said earlier, we had the consultants look at 4 neighborhoods. This is not to say there was nothing normative in terms of how we pick these neighborhoods other than that we thought they were good examples of a variety of different kinds of neighborhoods around the city. I will say we picked the short north for a reason, because it's kind of a clearly obvious one where the economics have changed. A couple statistics. When I first saw this slide and I compared the last two sets on this slide, I literally about fell out of my chair. So this is median household income growth from 2000 to 2016 in the city as a whole on the far left. Blue bar is 2000, red bar is 2010, and the green bar is the estimates for next year, or for last year. If you compare the short north in 2000 to the other three areas, the median household income in the short north in 2000 was the same as Linden and lower than the others. The pace of change, and in the world of real estate change and in the world of government, this is at lightning speed. To have that kind of change in that short period of time is stunning.
And you think that's a good thing?
One of the things I didn't say, yes, I do, but it is not an unmitigated good. I do think it's a good thing. I think it is a good thing that we are attracting people to this city that are bringing more wealth and more income, but it is not an unmitigated good. In my world, there is no such thing as an unmitigated good. Everything has, I wasn't a physics major, but I do know Newton's law that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? Everything has a consequence. This has had a consequence. This has pushed people out of the neighborhood. This has raised prices so that people can't get into the neighborhood. This slide's going to be important in a little bit, Willis, when we talk about the Near East Side. Willis isn't even listening to me. So if you look at, what I want you to compare here is the bottom bar and the top bar. So this is the age of the housing stock in various neighborhoods around the city. If you look at the bottom bar for the Near East Side and for the short north, they are the same. 45% of the housing stock in each of those neighborhoods was built before 1939. In the short north, 15% of the housing stock was built after 2000. And only, to this point, only 5% of the housing stock on the Near East Side was built after 2000. That is not a coincidence. The comparison between those two is not a coincidence, in my mind, right? Again, when we look at, and this part of the analysis is going to become important later, because when you talk about, if at the end of the day one of our objectives is to see more private sector development in a variety of neighborhoods, understanding how much the private sector can get in return for their investment is vital, because the private sector, whether it's for profit or not for profit, still needs to get their investment recouped. So you got to look at what the income stream is. And you can see across the three of the neighborhoods, we've had some growth in rents, but not tremendous growth between 2010 and 2017. Again, the story in the short north is very rapid growth over the last 5 to 7 years. The phenomenon that we have seen and is really fairly recent in terms of the short north. So this is your another one of your economics lessons for the night. When you look at whether or not the private sector will do a project, and how does the private sector analyze a project, and again, this is whether it's for profit or not for profit. they have different components to their project. They have the cost of the land, right? You got to build it on something, and that's got a cost. They got soft costs, so that's your engineers and your architects and your designers. They've got their hard costs, which is pretty self-explanatory, right? That's your wood and your concrete and your drywall and stuff you can touch. Very, 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 very rarely does anybody ever walk in with a suitcase full of cash, plunk it down, and say, I want to build a building, right? They go to the bank and they get a loan. And the bank has their interest rate that they're going to get. And then you have their return. For a not-for-profit, that return is very, very small. For a for-profit, that typically is about 8% of their investment. And that's what we have in our models here. So where incentives should come into play is saying, okay, if we look at what we think we can get in rents or for sale price and compare it to all those costs, can we cover our costs and get our return? And if you can't, you have a gap. The intent of the incentive is to fill that gap. So the fundamental question then is, in each of these neighborhoods, is there a gap? And if so, what is the gap and how does the incentive impact it? Does that make sense to everybody? You guys are fortunate because this is the fourth time I've done it. I think it's the first time I've gotten this slide right when I did the explanation. So we had the consultants look in each neighborhood. We had them look at a couple different types of construction. And in the Hilltop and Linden, and they're clumped together because when the consultants went through and did the analysis, they found that really there wasn't more than a penny or two difference between the economics of both neighborhoods. They found that the difference between what someone can get in rent or sale price in Linden in the Hilltop versus their cost to construct low-rise townhome style construction is about $90 a square foot. The abatement, so that means they're losing $90 for every square foot they build. The abatement covers about $20 of that if you do 100% 15-year abatement. So that leaves you still with a gap of $70 a square foot, and rents would essentially have to double to cover that. So when I talked at the outset about our conclusion that in those neighborhoods, the market is not ready to support for-profit private development in those neighborhoods. We have to do more. We have to find new ways to support bringing in investors into those communities to get housing built. This doesn't mean we give up. I mean, it would be easy to say, oh my God, we're never going to get, no, this doesn't mean we give up. It means we need to do more. It also doesn't mean that our objective is to raise rents. I mean, if we can manage to raise incomes and then we can manage to raise rents, that's great. But raising rents in and of itself is not the solution. So on the Near East Side, the townhome numbers are a little better. You would only need to see about a 40% increase in rent to make, with the abatement, to make the private development feasible. And on the mid-rise, so if you go up to kind of a wood frame on top of a concrete podium, think 6 stories high, the numbers are not great, but they're still within the realm of possibility. What I would say about the Near East Side, and this is why the comparison that I talked about earlier about the age of the housing stock and the position of the neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood, the Near East Side has the potential to take off pretty quickly. When you look at what's there already, where it's positioned, those kinds of things. And so we see that as a neighborhood that even though the numbers may look pretty similar to Linden and the Hilltop, the situation on the ground is appreciably different in a couple key ways. And so we think that with abatement alone, we can accomplish a lot on the Near East Side. So, and then the short north. So as I said earlier, what we discovered based on this admittedly somewhat artificial, but we think pretty solid analysis of what it would cost to build, again, mid-rise, 6-story, concrete, wood on top of concrete, you know, you got your parking underneath and go up a few stories. Development in the short north, we don't think no abatement is needed, and in fact, we're seeing that it is basically subsidizing about $27 per square foot back to the developer that's not needed in order to get the project built. When you talk about the higher density steel and concrete construction, structured parking, there is still a gap, but 100% 15-year abatement is too much. It's more than is needed to get the project built. So this all raises a lot of great questions that I think are some of the questions that you guys were getting to. So, and we'll come to them in a minute. The consultants recommended that we kind of divide the city up into 3 different kinds of categories. Those are persistently disinvested, those neighborhoods that we really need to do a lot more work before it's fully viable for the private sector. We need to find other ways to support projects. Those that are ready for revitalization, those neighborhoods that meet the criteria I talked about early on, where they're connected, they've got an interesting housing stock, they've got a great sense of community already, and we're seeing some investment coming in. And then those that are market ready. I think the short north in particular, that's the key example here. Their recommendation was that we kind of classify neighborhoods in the city along those basic outlines and offer differential incentives according to that. I don't know that that's the right answer. The more we've thought about it, I think there's a million different ways to split it, and this is where, as we were discussing doing these sessions, we wanted to step back and have some discussion with folks around what are the priorities. Because there's a lot of different ways we can go with this, but until we understand really fully what the community wants us to accomplish with the incentives, that prioritization is going to impact exactly how we implement what our changes are and exactly how we implement them. So some of the recommendations, as I said, was establish a neighborhood typology and give differential incentives. Based on that, one of the key recommendations is that we do not do something that is forever. We need to take the time to go back and reevaluate this periodically. I think probably 5 years is about the right amount of time. That gives developers time to plan, time to acquire land, time to get projects done while they know what the rules are, and then they have a predictable time period when the rules are going to change. Minimizing risk is the most important thing that you can do, one of the most important things that you can do in terms of getting projects done. And if we don't say when we're going to change the rules and we don't say how we're going to change the rules, that adds way too much risk. But we also can't lock in for forever, because then you end up with what we have today, which is a system that is kind of a layering of precedent. You know, we did this for this, we created this policy for this, we created this policy for that, we created this policy for that, but we didn't create a system of policies. Let's see, what were the other key ones? Yeah, those were in that discussion I covered about 5 of them. All right. Now let's have the big discussion on the housing side. So, right here.
No. Okay, there we go. You're a numbers person. Maybe some people back here who work for the government are numbers people, but I'm here to put a face, make it more personable. I don't agree with you about that Columbus has a lot of affordable places to live. Yes, on paper, that seems good, but a lot of them are high crime areas. I personally wasn't able to move into the city until I could afford to buy a house because I was afraid to live in an apartment in the city. And we don't have a lot of living wage jobs that are near us. And I think when you are thinking of incentivizing, you need to think quality for us. Because a lot of these big businesses...
I didn't catch the last thing you said. We need
quality instead of quantity, maybe. Because I'd be interested to see the Dublin, the New Albany, how many of those businesses stay there after their 15 mark is up? they'll probably just go move to another place where they can make a cutthroat deal. They're not loyal. So why aren't you thinking outside of the box? Think smaller, give incentives to people who want to start their own business. And also too, in regards to the east side, and there's just so many things floating in my head, sorry. When you said too, there's not a lot of places to build, go to every major corridor, 5th Avenue, Broad Street, Livingston, James Road, there's plenty of spaces, but you gotta think smaller instead of bigger. And also too, the reason I think the east side is the way it is, there's also a lot of older people who can't afford to take care of their houses anymore, and we need to think of plans on how to help them and help people who aren't making living wages. And I think transportation would be solved too. If people had a living wage near them, you wouldn't have to drive to work. And like, there's just so many.
Let me start unpacking a few of those things. And let me start with one of the last things you said, and I'm going to give credit to Robert Barksdale for a second, because Robert was part of a conversation that we held with some community development folks around town, and Robert's on the area commission here in Milo. And we were talking about new construction and how do we get new construction going, and Robert told the story of his family here and his neighbors, and talked about how important it is to make sure that we do things to make sure that the folks who've been in the neighborhood, own their home, doing the work, keeping the community great, still feel like they belong in the community, and still feel like and feel like it's not obvious when somebody drives down the street that they're the ones who've been there for 20 years. And am I summarizing it? Am I getting this about right? And so I think that's one of the things that we need to think about more as we do this, is how do we work with the individual homeowner that's been in the neighborhood. So to your point about where do we place development, I will say this about incentives for startups and small business. It's not enough money. It just isn't. The city's take on a job is 2.5% of the income. That's the entire take that we get. So if you have somebody who's making, God, let's see if I can do the math in my head. If you have somebody who's making $30,000 a year, well, let's do the math easier, $50,000 a year. I think that's $1,250 in total city income tax. The cost for us to administer an incentive is over $1,000. So there's not enough money there to do that. What we do, and we spend a lot of time on it, it's not a subject to this, but we've got a whole team that works on this. We do spend a lot of time for those small businesses making sure that they have great places to be. Because what's more important than a tax incentive for a small business is having a place that a customer wants to come to. And that's where our planning department and our facade grants for small businesses and those kinds of things come into play. To your point about transportation, absolutely, completely agree that transportation is fundamentally part of the solution. One of the things I frequently talk about is, as we look at how do we support housing, the other big thing that people talk about how do we support is transit, financially. We cannot allow we cannot allow the discussion about supporting housing to take away from the discussion about how do we support transit, because they are completely related. Our strategy, and I will tell you, it does not, you cannot get enough volume on our commercial corridors, on Main Street, on Cleveland Avenue, on Livingston, on Parsons. Well, there's one spot on Parsons where you can get some fair amount of massing of jobs. You can't get it enough to raise incomes in those neighborhoods. What you have to do is you have to connect people to the job centers. We have great job centers. We just need to do a better job of connecting people to them. I mean, the worst thing you can do, and I'm going to overstate for effect, so don't take this as gospel. One of the worst things that you can do is get somebody a job making $30,000, $35,000 a year, clear out in Licking County that they got to buy a beater car to drive to that breaks down, and then they lose the job and they still got the car that they got to pay for, right? We've got to do a better job of connecting transit. So this is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a whole rest of the puzzle that we're also working on. Okay, I know somebody else down here had a, okay, all right, we'll come to the back.
It was brought up in the earlier conversation when you were talking about business incentives, but the concept of inclusionary zoning, and in neighborhoods like the Short North, where rents do support development that can actually support retaining some units as affordable, what's the city's view on taking a stand, and maybe it's not necessarily a policy stand like across the city, but something that, you know, we're really trying to do because the only way, sorry, I'm going to get my soapbox for a second.
Yep.
The only way to have a sustainable community is to have a vibrant community, and that means everybody's included. So I guess, what do you think?
Inclusionary zoning is an incredibly complex question. And I think we get somewhere there in this. You know, and look, on the kind of, so for those of you, let me step out of, are you a planner by chance? No, I'm not. Okay, all right. So inclusionary zoning means putting into the zoning code that in order to build your building, you are required to have a certain set aside of affordability. What does affordable mean is a whole different set of questions, but you know, you can either define it as deeply affordable, folks making $40,000, $30,000 and less, or you can say kind of workforce housing, which is folks making $30,000 to $60,000 a year. Area median income in the region is about $60,000 for a household. So that's what there's literally the average person in the Columbus region is about, the average household in the Columbus region makes about $60,000 a year. So, and that's not average, that's median, so that leaves out Les Wexner, you know, it kind of sets him aside. There are a host of issues that go with that. One is, in Ohio law, how much right do we have to do it? Two, it does raise the cost. And how much ability do we have to raise that cost? Are there things that we can offer? Typically when inclusionary zoning has been done, what cities have, and it's mostly done on the coast, what cities have done is they've said, okay, we're going to require this, but there are two kind of caveats to it. One is we'll offer it, but you get to add an extra 2 stories to your building if you follow the inclusionary zoning code, or we'll reduce your parking requirement if you follow the inclusionary zoning code, or we'll let you buy yourself out of it. So if you don't, if you decide that it's just not worth it for you, you can, you know, we'll have a formula that says this is what the cost to you should be. You know, this is what the cost of including the affordable housing is, and you're going to pay that plus 5%. That's where people go with inclusionary zoning. It is a topic that, you know, I think when we get through this, and we see how this goes, is certainly a question we got to ask ourselves whether that's the next step we can go to. And I don't know, I honestly don't know clearly we've thought about it some, and I don't know the answer. Hold on, she hasn't had a chance to answer the question yet.
Okay, whoops, it's not, is it working? Oh, okay, thank you very much. So, I think the Short North got ahead of the curve. People did it without incentives. They attracted a community to it. And now, so for many years, everybody moved out of the center cities, and they were all neglected. And Franklinton was allowed to flood, and the streets weren't repaired, and the sewers backed up, and so forth. And and then as time went on, now it's being reversed. We have the millennials. They don't want a yard in Boeing. They want to be in the center city. So now the city is looking at, oh yeah, we got these center city areas we should develop. Well, I think developers are actually drooling over getting in here. So I'm confused as to why we need to give them, you know, real incentives. Maybe we could just let the people. It might look a little different too if the neighborhood communities decided what they wanted in their own communities. And I know developers are very powerful in this country, and they give a lot of in this city. I mean, they give a lot of political donations. So, you know, it's just I think the city needs to worry less about developers. There's a slogan about a chain is as strong as its weakest link. And I think perhaps the city is as strong as its weakest resident. And so I think that maybe that would, if the city focused on its weakest residents, I think that would be the best way to improve it. And I know that cities are getting less money from the states and the federal government. It's an income problem, and that has to do with you know, a lot of military spending and income tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. So thank you very much.
So here's why I care about developers. The city doesn't build housing. I don't own housing other than my own home. The city doesn't build, run, manage, rent, lease housing. Private sector does. And the numbers are what the numbers are. That's how much it costs to build something, and that's what you can get in rent. So that the only way that the project gets done is either rent goes up or costs come down. And incentives are nothing more than a cost reduction tool. That's what they are. So if you don't want rents to go up, then you got to find a way to bring costs down. It's because otherwise it doesn't make sense for the developer to do it. I don't care whether you know, the developers are most of the developers in this town are fine people. They're well-meaning. They're in business for a profit. But if their numbers don't work, they don't build it. And in a lot of our neighborhoods, the numbers don't work. What we've said is in the short north, for certain kinds, they now do work. So our question is, do we reduce the abatement, or do we take that money and redirect it? But it's not a question of we want to support developers because we want to support developers. I want to get projects built. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add to that something that Steve said earlier about the growth coming to Columbus. And if we don't worry about our building stock, we are not going to have enough product to deal with that growth. So what might happen is people aren't moving into the city, and jobs aren't coming into the city, and those budgetary implications in terms of cities versus suburbs really do start to come home to roost. So we have to think about our building stock, because I agree with you that you know, a city is only as strong as their weakest resident, but it's not just about addressing those who are struggling today. It's also about trying to position us 20 years down the line to do better and to not have as many residents who are struggling. And if we don't pay attention to our building stock, we are going to be at a disadvantage in addressing those issues. So there are a lot of tools to do it, and that's all on the table, but that's I think, general kind of ethic behind some of this that that we generally hold in the city, and I can't speak for everyone, but I do think it's important to consider.
All right, clearly I touched a nerve on a couple things. So the one who laughs the loudest at my jokes is always the one who gets the mic next, and then I'll come to you, I promise.
Well, I'm very reassured what you said about the Short North. We're one of those older people that moved in the 70s and fixed up the house and all that. I'm sure a lot of people here have gotten the Franklin County Auditor appraisals for the houses. And between the last appraisal we had and the one we just got, it went up $100,000 for us. So I feel like a significant harm to me. I feel if I'm going to be asked to sacrifice in that way, I'd like to get something back, something more back. That's all. This is my husband.
I'm going to take over. And you talked a lot about the financial perspective of the developers and the people who are building new homes and are building businesses. I just want to add a little bit to the long-term homeowners perspective. So, you know, we're paying more than 25 times as much taxes as when we moved into the neighborhood. 25 times. And yet we see these folks cruising up and down the street to their new apartment complex and their condos in cars that cost more than our houses. And we feel like, you know, our taxes are going up like crazy, and these people are paying nothing for 15 years. So we feel like we're subsidizing the rich and the better off people to move into our neighborhood and just basically overrun us while we're holding the schools together and other things. So that's our perspective.
And you know, this goes to what I said earlier when this is the exact same thing that I talked about with Robert's story, and we do, in looking at this, have to think about how we deal with that. I mean, yeah, you guys have made a great paper profit on your house, but it's the paper, but the paper is not green, right? It's just white. So, and there is an equity issue there that I think is something that isn't addressed in the report, but I think it's something that we're going to have to look at. I will say this about that. That is much, much less of a city issue than it is a county and schools issue, because we don't have the power, I think, have the power under state law to offer those kinds of exemptions. I may be wrong, we haven't really looked at it, but I think that tends to be much more of a county issue, and it's something we're going to have to bring to them and talk to them about how they handle it. But yeah. And I promised you ma'am, I promised you next, if you still have a question.
Comment. You're asking us to prioritize what our opinions are. So I support what people are saying here tonight. Our first priority needs to be affordable housing. Columbus is well known as being a city where wages and costs are almost equivalent, which is really a cool thing. Yeah. And we want to be that kind of city. That's the kind of city that attracts the artists and the innovative thinkers that help create the Short North. So once the Short North, which appears to be our paragon of something, I don't know what, because I don't think it's my paragon. Yeah. I would like to see something more sustainable, something more personal, which brings me to question 2. Really, it's a question. It's not on your slide. You haven't shown the slide, which is what are the NCR districts doing towards the creation of sustainable communities, which doesn't mean there's a Neiman Marcus on West Broad Street. What that means is that there are jobs, someone else already said it, on West Broad Street for the people who live at West Broad Street.
A couple things in that, and I think, you know, back to my earlier comment about, I do think the Short North has been successful in the sense that it has been a magnet for investment. It's become a magnet for people. It is a place that, you know, is a place that people want to come to. That has not been without a downside. And the conversation tonight really is about, and I think this is where I started in first or second slide, you know, we have had to traditionally had a fairly narrow set of objectives with our incentives. And the question is, what do we broaden those out to? So I think one of the things we've heard in all of our sessions is affordable housing. Affordable housing, affordable housing, affordable housing. That has been, I think, and I'm looking at Councilmember Brown, I think consistently that's been the one thing that has come up. People have brought up green building. A lot of people have brought up transit and smart construction, those kinds of things, but really it's been about affordable housing. Okay, you've been waiting, and I'll come to you in the back next. He's got the microphone there.
You've mentioned a lot of various parts, various components. What I'd like to know is where is the comprehensive city plan that pulls all of these together and shows us what the balance is between all of them? Other cities have a comprehensive city plan. Certainly would be nice for a city the size of Columbus that they have one.
So, and I'm just getting tired, so I sat down. And I think you just made someone else in the back of the room much more tired even. The head of our planning group, Kevin Wheeler, was hired as an intern to do the last city master plan. And if you look at Kevin, you can tell that's been a while. And, you know, we've talked, sorry, that was kind of, it was fine. I got a laugh. So, you know, we've talked about whether to do another master plan. Master plans cost, particularly for a city our size, cost $500,000 to $750,000 to do and do well. The direction we're going is not to do another citywide master plan. It is more to be very explicit about what our planning principles are and apply those to individual neighborhoods and individual plans. So, you know, it's something we've thought about, but when you look at the time and the effort and the money that goes into it, you know, that's what Nashville spent on theirs. Yes, sir. Or, I'm sorry, I told the gentleman back there that he was going to be next.
In terms of the, I know you spoke about it a little bit about a county issue. Is there or are there any tax increment financing or TIFs in this plan to go back into Columbus City schools, or is this just 100% clear abatement?
Okay, so tax increment financing, for those who don't understand, is where, so abatement is, we say you're just going to pay less taxes. Period, end of story, we're just going to discount your taxes. Tax increment financing is where you redirect the property taxes, and instead of going to those levy agencies, they go to allow us to do infrastructure to support development. The city, when we do tax increment financing, we only do what are called non-school TIFs. So our TIFs do not impact school revenue at all. That's been that way forever. I'm looking, yeah, forever. And we don't plan on changing that ever. So yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, let's go to the gentleman in front of him, and then I'll come back over to you.
My question was back with the numbers. Was there any calculation to include future projections of appreciation and what was going to happen here? Because just like these folks are seeing this 100,000 increase, in 10, 15 years, that investment may triple, quadruple in cost, and the guy that's developing it, he can run the time value money and see like, hey, what am I going to get my payout, you know, given opportunity and financing.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe you can't be competitive with other communities if you don't look at that, but I got to think that there's got to be a big payout on the back end of that.
Hey, Quentin Harris, do you know when they did the housing numbers, did they include an inflation factor when they ran the numbers? I assume they did. I just don't know what it was for the rent, for the revenue on the rents. Yeah. Okay. So to restate his question, basically he was asking whether our analysis said, okay, are you going to see inflation in the rent over time, and how does that impact it? They had an inflation factor. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't 10, 12%. It was probably 5, 6%. This is part of why we have said there needs to be a, whether it's 5-year, 10-year, whatever period it is, where you've got reevaluation of those markets that gives you essentially a business cycle and a half So hopefully you're not getting stuck too much in, okay, the market tanks, prices go haywire, you're cutting this right there, you've got enough time for the market to really change, you got enough time for developers to do their pro formas and really understand what the rules of the game are. That's how we're trying to manage that issue. We recognize that it's an issue, and that's why we don't want to say, okay, we're going to do this today, and it's going to run for 30 years, and then, you know, it's meaningless in the numbers we set are meaningless in 30 years. And I promised I was going to come back over here.
Thank you. I think there's a dark side to abatements that hasn't been brought up. So the assumption is Short North is the model. That's the success story.
That is no. We've said that's an example of what has happened.
Yes, but it was with, just look at your own numbers. You don't need abatements for anything under 6 stories, right?
Right.
You can make a profit. But that's not what's happened. If you look at the 5 major developments near where we live in Short North, all of those have been abated. The vast majority are well over 6 stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is you are increasing traffic in Short North, you are giving profits to developers, you're driving out small business in Short North. People don't want to live in Short North to have a whole bunch of condos next to them. They want to have the character of Short North retained. And because you don't have a plan in this city, you're now initiating streetscape to make it more attractive, but you're further decreasing the ability of people to go to Short North and park. You need a plan. You need to get rid of abatements where there is no need for abatements, and you need to repurpose it elsewhere in the city where there is a great need. And we don't want 6 12-story buildings in our backyard, which is what is happening now and is happening with Kaufman, who's going to have a 10-story building right in the middle of a neighborhood. So there is a dark side to this, and I think it has to be articulated.
Amen. So, a couple of things. So, what I will say is that what I said at the beginning. I do believe that this city needs more density, and that change is painful. And it will be painful for the residents, and it's going to change how we live. But I think that is, if we are going to have a sustainable city, we are going to require more density. That has not been without a cost. And also, I'll say, we need, and I know at least one person was here or at the Business First Forum on Tuesday, Monday, whatever it was, and so I apologize, you're going to hear the story twice. The way people think about parking is fundamentally changing. Last Tuesday at 11:55, I got a text from my son, who's 13, asking if I could get him the new iPhone 11 or 10. He does not care about a car. He can't take his face out of this. He's texting me from school, which we had to talk about the new iPhone at age 13. Do you think when he turns 18, he's going to want to take his face out of his phone? And where's the one place he can't have his face in a phone? Behind the wheel of a car. So we do need to think. We have partnered with a number of developers to build extra parking into private developments around the Short North. I don't see us as a city doing a lot more building of structured parking in the Short North, because it's been an okay investment, but I don't know that it's the right long-term investment. So I get your point about needing a plan, and I think there have been mistakes that we've made in the Short North. Part of this study, as I said earlier, is figuring out how we can do it better next time. So it's not that the Short North is the success story that we're pointing to. It's an example of where we've had some kinds of success, but not unmitigated success. And so the challenge is, how do we use the tools differently to get a better kind of success next time? Did you? Okay. Robert hasn't spoken on anything.
I want to thank everybody, city staff in particular, for having this meeting here in Milo Grogan. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. One of the things about Milo Grogan, as it relates to Italian Village, and people talking about all the success of Italian Village, is that, I'll give you an example. My parents bought their house in 1950 here in Milo Grogan. The kids in Milo Grogan went to middle school or junior high school at Everett, which is at 5th and High. There was a time when my parents would not allow us to go to the Garden Theater at 5th and High because of all the blight, okay? Now, as you say, all of that has changed. However, Milo Grogan has not. We have been left behind, so we appreciate these programs and being included, and we appreciate the fact that you are holding this meeting here so you can get a feel for those neighborhoods that have been left behind, and we are one of those neighborhoods.
Thanks, Mr. Barksdale.
Okay. And I think I've got time for, we'll do 2 more. Okay, right here.
Well, you're asking for priorities, and I would like to see where's the green space going to be.
Okay.
I'm so sick of seeing condo after condo after condo taking down green space that was promised to the city, and now you're taking it away. You know, you just killed 250 geese on the Scioto River because they got in the way of your development. No, you got in the way of where they live. That's not right. I live in Marion Village. We have the last ash trees left in this city, and you guys won't fund them. But you'll give a $65 million tax break to a billionaire, but you can't fund the last living ash trees that we have. Where's the green space? Where's the sustainability? Grow, grow, grow. You can't keep growing. We are a finite city. We have so much space. Our freeways are already maxed out. The only reason we're going to have more people moving here is because you keep providing developers with a lot of money to bring jobs here. Well, what about the people that live here that don't have jobs? What about sustainability? What about sustaining what we already have? I mean, I grew up on the Far East Side, went to Walnut Ridge High School. That area is the pits. You walk out this door, walk a half a block down the street, the houses are all boarded up. I mean, what about putting some money into the neighborhoods like the Hilltop, where no wonder nobody wants to invest there? You can barely live there without risking your life. So why can't we put some money into rehabbing the housing that already exists instead of using our green space to build condos?
So in terms of, yeah. So the other comment in terms of priority was green building and making sure that we insist on green building. In terms of green space, I'm not sure where you're talking about where city green space has been taken away for construction. I can't think of anywhere where we sold. So, and in terms of priorities, you know, in terms of preserving green space, we did ask the consultant to look at our green space parkland dedication ordinance and compare it to national standards. They essentially said we're pretty much within national standards. The challenge in terms of green space is how do you acquire enough money to then be able to buy the space? One thing that we are looking at in terms of what do we do when you talk about the money is requiring developers, when they get an incentive, to provide affordable housing, and if they don't, require them to pay into a fund that can then be used to support whatever the priorities are. And one of those priorities could be affordable housing, one of them could be green space acquisition, could be a variety of things. So, and these abatements are available for rehab. Every abatement that we do is available for rehab. That's because the numbers don't make sense. That's the whole point in some of these neighborhoods. All right, I've got seriously. I'm willing to stick around and talk to folks a little bit, but I promised I would take 2 more questions, and I'm looking for somebody who hasn't asked a question. You haven't asked a question.
So two things. I'm thinking that it might be kind of helpful to kind of marry the piece that you're talking about in terms of development with more specific neighborhood discussion, such as what Director Carla Williams-Scott would bring to a conversation, you know, talking about help for individual homeowners, what is being done in that fashion, as well as what's happening with the private development that's occurring around Nationwide. I think those are pieces that they're parts of the puzzle that maybe people aren't hearing today. Last thing, some of that might also be answered within, someone asked a question about a grand plan. People do need to see how those things get together.
And so this is a small piece of the whole picture. So I talked earlier about we're working on transit issues. We're working on a restatement of our planning principles without going all the way to spending $750,000 on a planning exercise. We're looking at how do we go into neighborhoods and do a more complete strategic plan for that neighborhood that addresses not just housing, but addresses education, it addresses workforce, it addresses access, it addresses safety. This is a very small, this is one tool in that entire set. We are under no illusion, and I think the numbers show it, there is no illusion that tweaking an abatement lever is going to be the solution to a neighborhood, nor is it the source of all ill in a neighborhood, right? It is a piece of the puzzle. What we've done with the study is I think now we have a better sense of how big a piece of the puzzle it is. And what I'm going to run this puzzle analogy into the ground. What can happen when we take that piece of the puzzle and we move it around a little bit and we change the shape of it? But it is not by any means the have-all, end-all, be-all. So with that, I'm going to close. I want to, again, thank my team that's here and has been helping out on this. I want to thank Councilmember Brown for helping us put these on and really being someone who's pushed us to do this stuff and work on these issues and been a partner with us. And again, thank you all for coming out. You don't get paid to do this. You don't get paid to come and advocate for your communities. And I really do appreciate it. So thanks. Yes, ma'am.